The summer sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as children's laughter echoed through the suburban neighborhood of Cedar Falls, Illinois. It was the kind of evening that painted memories in golden hues, where fireflies would soon begin their nightly dance, and mothers would call their children home for dinner. 8-year-old Tommy Brennan pedaled his red bicycle down the familiar sidewalk, his Superman cape fluttering behind him like a promise of adventure. The cape had been a birthday gift from his father, Michael, who watched from the front porch with a mixture of pride and protective concern. Michael Brennan had always been the kind of father who believed in giving his son just enough freedom to explore the world while keeping him safely within reach. The neighborhood felt secure, with its tree-lined streets and friendly faces that had watched Tommy grow from a toddler taking his first steps to the energetic boy who now raced his bike with fearless determination. Mrs. Henderson from next door often waved from her garden, and old Mr. Garcia always had a kind word when Tommy passed by his house. It was the America that parents dreamed of raising their children in, where community still meant something and children could play outside until the streetlights came on. But on July 15, 2015, that sense of security would shatter like glass against concrete. Tommy had been playing in the front yard, his bicycle abandoned on the lawn as he chased butterflies with a net his grandmother had given him. Michael had stepped inside for no more than 10 minutes to take a work call, glancing out the window periodically to check on his son. When he returned to the porch, the yard was empty except for the abandoned bicycle and the butterfly net lying forgotten in the grass. Tommy was gone. Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from today in the comments below. If you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and moments of justice, please consider subscribing. The initial search began with Michael calling Tommy's name, his voice growing more desperate with each unanswered shout. Neighbors emerged from their homes, their faces etched with concern as they joined the frantic search through backyards and side streets. Mrs. Henderson wrung her hands nervously, explaining how she had seen Tommy playing just moments before she went inside to check on her dinner. Mr. Garcia walked the perimeter of his property twice, his weathered hands shaking as he pushed aside bushes and peered under porches. Within an hour, Cedar Falls Police Department had mobilized every available unit. Detective Sarah Martinez, a seasoned investigator with kind eyes and an unwavering determination, took charge of the case. She interviewed each neighbor methodically, taking notes in her worn leather notebook as she tried to piece together Tommy's final movements. The Brennan house became a command center, with officers coordinating search efforts while Michael and his wife Linda, who had rushed home from work, clung to each other in a state of shock. The search expanded as daylight faded. Volunteer firefighters combed through the nearby woods with flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness like desperate prayers. Search and rescue dogs were brought in, their handlers guiding them through the neighborhood as they followed scent trails that seemed to vanish mysteriously at the end of Maple Street. The local news crews arrived, their bright lights illuminating the growing crowd of concerned citizens who had come to help find the missing boy. As the hours turned into days, the community rallied around the Brennan family with an outpouring of support that restored some faith in humanity's capacity for compassion. Flyers with Tommy's smiling face appeared on every telephone pole and storefront window within a 50-mile radius. His school picture, showing a gap-toothed grin and sparkling brown eyes, became an image seared into the collective consciousness of Cedar Falls. Local businesses donated food and supplies for the search teams, while volunteers organized systematic sweeps of parks, abandoned buildings, and wooded areas. Detective Martinez worked tirelessly, following every lead, no matter how small. She interviewed registered sex offenders in the area, checked traffic cameras from nearby intersections, and coordinated with the FBI when the case officially became a federal investigation after 24 hours. The initial focus centered on the possibility of stranger abduction, but as days passed without ransom demands or credible sightings, the investigation began to consider other possibilities that no parent should ever have to contemplate. Michael found himself caught between hope and despair, clinging to the belief that Tommy was alive somewhere, while battling the dark thoughts that crept into his mind during the sleepless nights. He walked the neighborhood constantly, knocking on doors he had already knocked on, asking questions that had already been answered, driven by a father's desperate need to do something, anything, that might bring his son home. The red bicycle remained in the front yard where Tommy had left it, a silent testament to a childhood interrupted and a family's world turned upside down. The weeks following Tommy's disappearance blurred together in a haze of false hopes and crushing disappointments. Every phone call sent Michael's heart racing. Every knock at the door brought a surge of anticipation that maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment his son walked through the door with an incredible story of adventure and survival. Instead, each day brought only more questions and fewer answers, as if Tommy had simply vanished into thin air. Detective Martinez had seen cases like this before, but the complete absence of evidence troubled her in ways she couldn't articulate. There were no signs of struggle in the Brennan yard, no tire tracks from an unfamiliar vehicle, no witnesses who remembered seeing anything unusual. It was as if an 8-year-old boy had simply stepped out of existence, leaving behind only the echo of his laughter and the memory of his Superman cape catching the evening breeze. The investigation took on a methodical rhythm that became both reassuring and maddening for the Brennan family. Search teams continued to comb through ever-widening circles around the neighborhood, using sophisticated ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging equipment that the state had made available. Divers searched the quarry lake 5 miles outside of town, their efforts yielding nothing more than old tires and discarded fishing equipment. Helicopter searches covered hundreds of square miles of farmland and forest, while volunteers on foot examined every abandoned barn and outbuilding in 3 counties. Linda Brennan threw herself into organizing the search efforts with a fierce determination that masked her growing desperation. She coordinated with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, learning the heartbreaking statistics about child abduction while refusing to accept that her son might become another number in their files. She appeared on local television programs, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to overwhelm her as she pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Michael's approach to coping was different, but equally consuming. He created a detailed timeline of Tommy's final day, mapping out every minute from the moment his son woke up until the devastating discovery that he was gone. He interviewed neighbors repeatedly, convinced that someone must have seen something that could provide the crucial clue needed to bring Tommy home. His notebook filled with fragments of information and observations that seemed meaningless individually, but might form a pattern that could solve the mystery. The neighborhood itself began to change in subtle ways. Parents who had once allowed their children to play freely outside now kept them within arm's reach. The sense of community that had been so strong during the initial search efforts gradually gave way to an underlying tension as neighbors began to look at each other with new suspicions. Who among them might know more than they were saying? Which friendly face might be hiding a terrible secret? 3 months into the investigation, Detective Martinez faced the painful reality that active search efforts would need to be scaled back. The initial massive deployment of resources couldn't be sustained indefinitely, and other cases required attention. She assured the Brennan family that the case would remain open and active, but the daily briefings and coordinated search operations would give way to a more patient, methodical investigation that followed leads as they developed. This transition marked a turning point for Michael Brennan. The structured activity of the search efforts had provided a sense of purpose and forward momentum, even when they yielded no results. Now, faced with the prospect of waiting for leads that might never come, he struggled to find meaning in the ordinary routines of life. How could he return to work when his son was still missing? How could he sit through a meal when Tommy's empty chair seemed to dominate the dining room? The holidays that year were particularly brutal. Halloween arrived with its parade of costumed children, a cruel reminder of the Superman cape that had once brought Tommy such joy. Thanksgiving felt hollow without Tommy's voice asking when dinner would be ready, and Christmas presented the impossible question of whether to buy presents for a child who might never come home to open them. The family decided to leave Tommy's stocking hanging on the mantel, a symbol of faith that felt increasingly fragile with each passing day. As winter settled over Cedar Falls, the case file on Tommy's disappearance grew thicker, with reports and statements, but no closer to resolution. Detective Martinez continued to follow up on tips that came in from across the country, investigating claimed sightings that inevitably proved false but couldn't be ignored. Each dead end felt like a small betrayal of the family's trust and hope, but she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that somewhere, someone knew what had happened to Tommy Brennan. The first anniversary of Tommy's disappearance approached like a storm on the horizon, bringing with it the terrible realization that this might not be a temporary crisis, but a permanent change to the fabric of their lives. The community planned a memorial service, not to mark Tommy's death, but but to honor his life and renew the commitment to finding him. For Michael and Linda, it represented both a celebration of their son's memory and an admission that they might be preparing for a very long wait for answers. The second year of Tommy's absence brought a different kind of anguish, one that settled into the Brennan household like dust on forgotten furniture. The acute panic of the initial weeks had evolved into a chronic ache that colored every moment of every day. Michael found himself developing routines that accommodated the searching, rising each morning before dawn to walk the neighborhood streets, scrutinizing every shadow and corner as if Tommy might materialize from the morning mist. Detective Martinez had been reassigned to other cases, though she checked in with the Brennans monthly and assured them that Tommy's file remained active. New tips still came in sporadically, most from well-meaning strangers who thought they had spotted a boy matching Tommy's description in distant cities. Each lead required investigation, sending Michael on desperate drives to check out reports from Chicago, St. Louis, and even as far as Denver, where a store clerk was certain she had seen Tommy buying candy with an older man who gave her an uneasy feeling. These journeys became Michael's obsession and his torment. He would drive for hours based on the flimsiest of leads, his heart hammering with hope as he arrived at the reported location, only to discover that the boy in question was either clearly not Tommy or had never existed at all. The drive home from these failed missions felt like a form of emotional torture, each mile marker counting down to another day of not knowing, another night of lying awake wondering if his son was calling for help somewhere beyond his reach. Linda handled the ongoing crisis differently, throwing herself into advocacy work for missing children. She joined support groups for families facing similar tragedies, finding both comfort and additional sorrow in the stories of other parents whose children had vanished without explanation. She learned the statistics by heart: how many children go missing each year, what percentage are found alive, how the odds change as time passes. The numbers became both her anchor and her nightmare, providing a framework for understanding their situation, while emphasizing how unlikely a happy ending had become. The neighborhood around the Brennan home had settled into an uneasy new normal. The missing child posters had weathered and faded, replaced periodically by fresh copies that seemed to make Tommy's absence more real rather than less. Some neighbors continued to offer support and encouragement, but others had begun to avoid the Brennans altogether, as if prolonged grief might be contagious, or as if the family's tragedy served as an unwelcome reminder of how quickly a secure world could collapse. Michael's relationship with work became increasingly strained. His engineering firm had been understanding initially, granting him extended leave and expressing sympathy for his situation. However, as months turned into years, the implicit pressure to return to normal functioning grew stronger. Coworkers who had once asked daily about developments in the case now changed the subject quickly when Tommy's name came up, uncomfortable with the ongoing nature of the family's crisis. The investigation itself had reached a frustrating plateau. Detective Martinez's replacement, Detective James Kowalski, was competent and dedicated, but he was working with the same limited evidence that had stymied the case from the beginning. He reviewed the files regularly, looking for connections that might have been missed, and he maintained contact with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, hoping that new techniques or insights might shed light on Tommy's disappearance. One development that troubled Detective Kowalski was the emergence of internet conspiracy theories about the case. Online forums dedicated to missing children had latched onto Tommy's story, generating elaborate theories about everything from underground trafficking rings to government cover-ups. While most of these theories were clearly fantastical, they generated a steady stream of false tips and wild accusations that consumed investigative resources while providing no useful information. Michael found himself drawn to these online discussions, despite Linda's pleading that he stay away from them. The forums offered a community of people who believed that Tommy was still alive and recoverable, providing a counterbalance to the growing sense among official investigators that the case might never be solved. He spent hours reading posts from amateur detectives who claimed to have identified patterns in similar cases, or who offered to conduct their own searches based on psychic visions or complex mathematical calculations. The third anniversary of Tommy's disappearance was marked by a smaller memorial service, attended primarily by family members and a core group of neighbors who had never stopped believing that answers would eventually come. The local media covered the anniversary with a brief segment that recycled footage from the initial search efforts, serving as a reminder to the community that the case remained unsolved. For Michael and Linda, the coverage felt both necessary and painful, keeping Tommy's story alive while emphasizing how much time had passed without resolution. As the seasons cycled through their familiar patterns, Michael began to notice changes in himself that concerned him. His memory seemed less reliable, and he found himself questioning details about Tommy that he had once known with absolute certainty. Was his son left-handed or right-handed? Did he prefer chocolate or vanilla ice cream? These uncertainties terrified him more than the ongoing mystery of Tommy's disappearance, representing a different kind of loss that felt like a betrayal of his role as a father. The fourth year brought a development that seemed promising initially, but ultimately deepened the mystery. A construction crew working on a shopping center 20 miles from Cedar Falls discovered what appeared to be a child's remains buried beneath what had once been a wooded area. The discovery sent Michael and Linda through another emotional roller coaster as DNA tests were conducted, hoping for closure while dreading what that closure might mean. When the results came back negative, ruling out any connection to Tommy, the relief was mixed with renewed despair about how many children had gone missing over the years. By the fifth year, Michael Brennan had developed what could only be described as a systematic approach to searching that bordered on the obsessive. He had divided Cedar Falls and the surrounding area into grids, methodically searching each section with a thoroughness that would have impressed professional investigators. His garage had been transformed into a command center filled with maps covered in colored pins, each representing a location searched, a tip investigated, or a theory explored. The maps told the story of a father's refusal to surrender hope, but they also revealed the toll that 5 years of searching had taken on Michael's psyche. Some areas had been searched dozens of times, marked with multiple pins in different colors, as he returned again and again to locations that seemed promising or significant. The woods behind the elementary school bore red pins indicating searches conducted during different seasons, as if the changing landscape might reveal clues that had been hidden during previous visits. Linda worried about her husband's increasing isolation and his growing detachment from the realities of their day-to-day existence. Michael had taken early retirement from his engineering firm, using his pension and savings to fund his private investigation efforts. He had installed sophisticated computer equipment in their home office, using database searches and social media monitoring to track down leads that law enforcement might have missed or dismissed. His commitment was admirable, but frightening in its intensity. Detective Kowalski had been replaced by Detective Amanda Foster, a young investigator who brought fresh eyes to the case but had to work within the same limitations that had constrained her predecessors. She met with Michael monthly, patiently reviewing his latest theories and evidence, while gently trying to manage his expectations. She respected his dedication, but worried that his amateur investigation might inadvertently compromise any future developments in the official case. The neighborhood had changed significantly over 5 years. Several families had moved away, unable to bear the constant reminder of tragedy that the Brennan house represented. New residents often learned about Tommy's disappearance from neighbors, creating an oral history that grew more dramatic with each telling. Some newcomers went out of their way to support Michael and Linda, while others treated them with the awkward sympathy typically reserved for those touched by inexplicable tragedy. Michael's search methodology had evolved to include techniques he had learned from online forums and true crime documentaries. He had purchased metal detectors and learned to operate them with surprising proficiency, spending weekends combing through parks and vacant lots in search of any evidence that might have been overlooked. He had also begun to pay attention to patterns in other missing child cases, looking for connections that might suggest a serial predator operating in the region. One theory that had captured Michael's imagination involved the possibility that Tommy had been taken by someone he knew and trusted, someone who could approach him without triggering alarm or resistance. This line of thinking led Michael to compile detailed backgrounds on every adult who had regular contact with Tommy prior to his disappearance. Teachers, coaches, family friends, neighbors, delivery workers, maintenance personnel. Anyone who had been part of Tommy's world became a potential suspect in Michael's increasingly paranoid worldview. The investigation into neighbors proved particularly challenging and divisive. Michael's questions became more pointed and persistent over time, sometimes crossing the line from concerned inquiry to uncomfortable interrogation. Mrs. Henderson, who had been so supportive during the initial search efforts, began to avoid Michael altogether after he asked detailed questions about her late husband's work schedule on the day Tommy disappeared. Mr. Garcia, now in his 80s, was hurt and confused by Michael's suggestions that his story about seeing Tommy playing in the yard might be inaccurate. Linda found herself in the impossible position of trying to support her husband's search efforts while maintaining relationships with neighbors who were growing increasingly uncomfortable with his intensity. She understood Michael's need to pursue every possible lead, but she also recognized that his approach was alienating people who might possess useful information. The balance between honoring their son's memory and preserving their own sanity seemed to shift daily, creating tension that tested their marriage in ways they had never anticipated. The 6th year brought a development that seemed to validate Michael's persistent approach to the investigation. A man named David Chen, who had lived 3 streets over from the Brennans at the time of Tommy's disappearance, was arrested in connection with child pornography charges discovered during an unrelated computer investigation. The arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood and gave Michael renewed energy for his search efforts, convinced that he had been right to suspect that someone local was involved in Tommy's disappearance. Detective Foster pursued the Chen connection aggressively, obtaining search warrants for his property and conducting extensive interviews about his activities during the summer of 2015. However, despite Michael's certainty that Chen must be connected to Tommy's case, the investigation failed to produce any evidence linking him to the boy's disappearance. Chen's computer records showed no searches related to Tommy, and his alibi for the afternoon of July 15th was solid, corroborated by work records and security footage from his employer. The disappointment of another false lead hit Michael harder than usual, perhaps because he had allowed himself to believe that Chen's arrest represented the breakthrough he had been seeking for 6 years. Linda found her husband in the garage late one night, sitting among his maps and pins, weeping with a depth of grief that she hadn't seen since the earliest days after Tommy's disappearance. The realization that they might never find their son seemed to wash over him like a wave, leaving him smaller and more fragile than she had ever seen him. Recovery from this emotional nadir took months, during which Michael's search activities diminished significantly. He continued to monitor online forums and respond to tips, but the systematic grid searches and neighborhood interviews became less frequent. Linda hoped that this might represent a healthy acceptance of the limitations of their private investigation, but she worried that Michael was sliding into a depression that might prove as dangerous as his previous obsessions. The 7th year of Tommy's absence brought an unexpected shift in Michael's approach to the search. Rather than the methodical grid patterns that had characterized his previous efforts, he began to focus on what he called intuitive searching, following hunches and impressions that seemed to call to him from different areas of the community. This new methodology was less systematic but somehow more desperate, as if he was running out of rational approaches and had to rely on something deeper and more primitive. Linda watched her husband's transformation with a mixture of concern and admiration. The maps in the garage remained covered with pins, but Michael rarely consulted them anymore. Instead, he would wake up in the morning with a sense that he needed to search a particular area, often somewhere he had never been before or somewhere that seemed to have no logical connection to Tommy's disappearance. These impulses led him to explore abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town, to walk through cemeteries at dawn, and to spend hours sitting in parking lots where he claimed to feel Tommy's presence. Detective Foster had been promoted to sergeant, and Tommy's case was now handled by Detective Marcus Williams, a veteran investigator who had worked dozens of missing person cases over his career. Williams brought a different perspective to the case, focusing less on the initial investigation and more on the possibility that new evidence might eventually surface through unrelated investigations or changes in circumstances. He maintained regular contact with Michael, but encouraged him to consider the possibility that closure might come through acceptance rather than discovery. The suggestion that Michael should move on or find peace with not knowing what happened to Tommy was met with fierce resistance. Michael interpreted such advice as a betrayal of his son's memory and an abandonment of his fundamental responsibility as a father. He argued that Tommy might still be alive somewhere, possibly held captive by someone who had managed to evade detection for 7 years. As long as that possibility existed, however remote, Michael felt morally obligated to continue searching. This period marked the beginning of Michael's exploration of alternative investigative methods that existed on the fringes of conventional law enforcement. He consulted with psychics who claimed to have visions of Tommy's location, though their descriptions were invariably vague and contradictory. He hired a private investigator who specialized in cold cases, though the man's efforts largely duplicated work that had already been done by police. He even arranged for ground-penetrating radar searches of areas identified through dowsing, an ancient practice that claimed to locate hidden objects through supernatural means. The financial cost of these alternative approaches was substantial, eating into the family's savings and retirement accounts at an alarming rate. Linda found herself having difficult conversations with Michael about their long-term financial security, trying to balance respect for his commitment to finding Tommy with practical concerns about their ability to maintain their home and meet their basic needs. These discussions often ended in arguments, with Michael accusing Linda of caring more about money than their son's welfare. The emotional cost was even higher. Michael's relationship with his remaining family members became increasingly strained as his obsession with finding Tommy consumed more and more of his attention and energy. Linda's sister had stopped inviting them to family gatherings, explaining privately that Michael's intensity made everyone uncomfortable and that his constant talk about the investigation dominated every conversation. Old friends had gradually drifted away, unable to maintain relationships that revolved entirely around tragedy and loss. Despite these challenges, there were moments when Michael's persistence seemed to yield meaningful results. His detailed knowledge of missing person cases in the region had helped other families by providing connections and insights that they might have missed. He had become an unofficial resource for parents facing similar tragedies, offering both practical advice about conducting searches and emotional support from someone who understood their desperation. These interactions gave Michael's efforts a sense of purpose beyond his own family situation. The approach of the 8th anniversary of Tommy's disappearance brought a development that would change everything. Michael had been following news reports about a child abuse case in a neighboring county, where authorities had discovered that a foster family had been systematically abusing children in their care for several years. The case involved multiple properties and had revealed a network of individuals who had been involved in exploiting vulnerable children. While the details were horrific, Michael saw an opportunity to investigate whether Tommy might have been connected to this network. His research into the foster abuse case led him to compile information about all registered foster families and group homes within a 100-mile radius of Cedar Falls during the summer of 2015. This list included dozens of facilities and hundreds of individuals who had been licensed to care for children. The scope of the investigation seemed overwhelming, but Michael approached it with the same systematic determination that had characterized all his search efforts over the past 7 years. One name on his list caught his attention in a way that he couldn't immediately explain. Robert Henley had operated a foster home about 40 miles from Cedar Falls and had lost his license in late 2015 following complaints about his treatment of children in his care. The timing seemed significant, and Michael began to investigate Henley's background more thoroughly. What he discovered was a pattern of moving from community to community, always staying just ahead of investigations into his conduct. Michael's investigation revealed that Henley had lived in Cedar Falls briefly in 2014, renting a house just 6 blocks from the Brennan home. He had moved away several months before Tommy's disappearance, but the proximity seemed too significant to ignore. Michael began to wonder if Henley might have returned to the area in July 2015, perhaps familiar enough with the neighborhood to know which children lived where and when they might be vulnerable to abduction. The realization that he might have identified a credible suspect after 7 years of searching filled Michael with a renewed sense of purpose and energy. He threw himself into investigating Henley's background with an intensity that worried Linda, but also gave her hope that they might finally be approaching answers. The possibility that Tommy's disappearance might be solved through Michael's persistent efforts seemed to validate everything he had sacrificed and endured over the past 7 years. Michael's investigation into Robert Henley became an obsession that surpassed even his previous search efforts. He spent days at the public library, using their computers and databases to trace Henley's movements over the past decade. What emerged was a disturbing pattern of a man who seemed to specialize in working with vulnerable children, while consistently staying one step ahead of authorities who grew suspicious of his methods and motivations. Henley's background revealed a man in his mid-50s who had never married but had devoted his life to what appeared to be child welfare work. He had operated foster homes in at least 6 different states, always presenting himself as a committed advocate for children who had been failed by the system. However, Michael's research revealed a troubling pattern of complaints and investigations that followed Henley wherever he worked. Parents alleged inappropriate behavior, former foster children made disturbing accusations, and child welfare workers expressed concerns about his facilities and methods. The most disturbing discovery was that Henley had a talent for identifying children who were unlikely to be missed, or whose disappearances might be attributed to running away rather than abduction. His foster homes consistently housed children with histories of behavioral problems, family conflicts, or previous failed placements. When some of these children disappeared from his care, Henley was able to provide plausible explanations about their tendency to run away or their desire to return to previous living situations. Michael compiled a list of 12 children who had vanished while under Henley's care or shortly after leaving his facilities. The cases spanned 8 years in 6 states, creating a geographic pattern that suggested deliberate planning rather than coincidental misfortune. Most troubling was the fact that none of these disappearances had been connected by law enforcement agencies, allowing Henley to continue operating without facing scrutiny for the pattern of missing children associated with his work. Detective Williams was initially skeptical when Michael presented his findings about Henley. The connection seemed tenuous, based primarily on geographic proximity and timing rather than concrete evidence. However, as Michael shared more details about Henley's background and the pattern of missing children, Williams began to take the theory more seriously. He agreed to request information from other jurisdictions where Henley had operated, looking for any evidence that might support Michael's suspicions. The investigation into Henley's possible connection to Tommy's case was complicated by the fact that the man seemed to have vanished as completely as the children who had disappeared from his care. His last known address was a post office box in Nevada that had been closed for over a year. His foster care license had been permanently revoked following an investigation in Utah, but no criminal charges had been filed due to insufficient evidence and the reluctance of former foster children to testify about their experiences. Michael's search for Henley became a full-time occupation that took him to libraries and government offices across multiple states. He learned to navigate bureaucratic systems and databases with the skill of a professional investigator, developing sources within child welfare agencies who were willing to share information about Henley's activities. Some of these sources were former employees who had harbored suspicions about Henley but had never been able to prove their concerns. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Michael had posted information about his search for Henley on several online forums dedicated to missing children cases. A woman named Sarah Jenkins contacted him privately, explaining that she had been a foster child in Henley's care in Colorado and had information that might be useful. Sarah's story was both heartbreaking and revealing, painting a picture of a man who used his position of authority to exploit and control vulnerable children. According to Sarah, Henley operated what amounted to a trafficking network, moving children between different facilities and private residences, where they could be exploited by individuals willing to pay for access. The operation was sophisticated enough to avoid detection by maintaining the appearance of legitimate child welfare work, while creating opportunities for abuse that were virtually impossible to prosecute. Children who threatened to expose the operation simply disappeared, with their disappearances attributed to running away or returning to previous living situations. Sarah's information included details about properties that Henley had used for his operations, including several locations that were not connected to his official foster care activities. One of these properties was a rural compound in southern Illinois, about 60 miles from Cedar Falls, that Henley had purchased through a shell corporation in 2014. According to Sarah, this facility was used as a holding location for children who were being prepared for placement in more permanent situations. Michael shared Sarah's information with Detective Williams, who immediately began the process of obtaining search warrants for the Illinois property. The legal process was complicated by the fact that Henley's connection to the property was hidden behind multiple layers of corporate entities, requiring extensive investigation to establish probable cause for a search. Michael chafed at the delays, convinced that evidence was being destroyed or hidden while they waited for legal approval. The property search was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early fall, nearly 8 years after Tommy's disappearance. Michael was not allowed to participate directly in the search, but Detective Williams agreed to keep him informed about developments as they occurred. Linda decided to accompany Michael to the command posts that had been established near the property. understanding that this might be the moment they had been waiting for throughout their 7-year ordeal. As they drove toward the search location, Michael felt a mixture of anticipation and terror that he hadn't experienced since the earliest days of Tommy's disappearance. The possibility that they might finally learn what had happened to their son was almost overwhelming, particularly given the horrific nature of what Sarah had described about Henley's operations. Part of him hoped that Tommy had died quickly rather than enduring years of exploitation and abuse, while another part clung to the possibility that his son might still be alive and recoverable. The Illinois property consisted of a main house, several outbuildings, and what appeared to be underground facilities that were not visible from aerial photographs. The search team included specialists in excavating buried evidence, as well as experts in analyzing electronic data that might reveal information about Henley's activities. Michael watched from a distance as investigators methodically processed the site, looking for any trace of Tommy or the other children who had vanished in connection with Henley's operations. The search of Henley's Illinois property extended through 3 grueling days that tested Michael's emotional endurance in ways he had never imagined. The methodical excavation of the underground facilities revealed a sophisticated network of hidden rooms and tunnels that spoke to years of planning and construction. The investigators worked with the careful precision of archaeologists, documenting every detail as they uncovered evidence of activities that confirmed Sarah Jenkins' worst allegations about Henley's operation. Michael remained at the command post throughout the search, receiving periodic updates from Detective Williams that were both encouraging and heartbreaking. The property had clearly been used to house children, with evidence of multiple occupants over several years. Personal items, clothing, and toys were recovered from various locations, each piece carefully cataloged and photographed before being sent for analysis. The discovery of children's belongings gave Michael hope that Tommy's possessions might be among the evidence, providing concrete proof that his son had been held at this location. The most disturbing discoveries came from the electronic evidence recovered from computer equipment hidden in the underground facilities. Hard drives contained thousands of images and videos documenting the exploitation of children who had been held at the property over several years. The digital evidence revealed the scope of Henley's operation and provided investigators with leads about other individuals who had been involved in the trafficking network. However, the volume of evidence also meant that analysis would take weeks or months before investigators could determine whether Tommy appeared in any of the recovered materials. On the second day of the search, investigators discovered what appeared to be a burial site in a wooded area behind the main house. The careful excavation of this location revealed the remains of 3 children, all of whom appeared to have been between the ages of 8 and 12 at the time of their deaths. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigative team and prompted the expansion of the search to include additional areas where other burial sites might be located. Michael's reaction to the discovery of the burial site was complex and painful. Part of him hoped that Tommy's remains might be found, providing the closure that had eluded their family for 8 years. However, the thought of his son's body lying in an unmarked grave for years was almost unbearable, challenging his ability to maintain the composure that had sustained him throughout his long search. Linda found herself in the impossible position of hoping both that Tommy would be found and that he wouldn't be found among the recovered remains. The identification process for the recovered remains would require DNA analysis and comparison with samples from families of missing children across multiple states. Detective Williams explained that this process could take several weeks, during which the Brennan family would have to endure another period of uncertain waiting. However, the detective was optimistic that the evidence recovered from the property would eventually provide answers not only about Tommy's fate, but about the fates of many other children who had disappeared in connection with Henley's activities. The media attention surrounding the discovery of Henley's property was intense and overwhelming. News crews from across the region descended on the rural location, creating a circus atmosphere that complicated the investigation and invaded the privacy of families who were hoping for news about their missing children. Michael found himself thrust into the spotlight as reporters sought interviews about his role in uncovering Henley's connection to multiple missing child cases. Michael's transformation from grieving father to amateur detective had made him something of a celebrity within the missing children community. Parents from across the country contacted him seeking advice about conducting their own investigations, and he was invited to speak at conferences about missing children advocacy. While he appreciated the recognition of his efforts, Michael remained focused on obtaining answers about Tommy's specific situation, rather than becoming a public figure in the broader cause. The analysis of evidence from Henley's property proceeded slowly, with investigators working to identify connections between the recovered materials and specific missing children cases. Michael received regular updates from Detective Williams, but the technical nature of the analysis meant that definitive answers would take time to develop. Each day brought the possibility of breakthrough information, but also the growing realization that some questions might never be fully answered, even if Tommy's connection to the property was established. 3 weeks after the property search, Detective Williams called Michael with news that would change everything. DNA analysis had confirmed that one of the recovered children's remains belonged to a boy who had been missing from Ohio for 6 years, providing closure for another family while demonstrating the scope of Henley's criminal activities. However, the detective also had more troubling news. Analysis of the digital evidence had revealed images of Tommy, confirming that he had indeed been held at the Illinois property at some point after his disappearance. The confirmation that Tommy had been at Henley's facility was both devastating and vindicating for Michael. His 8-year investigation had been validated, proving that his instincts about the case had been correct, and that persistence could yield results even when official investigations reached dead ends. However, the knowledge that his son had suffered the kind of exploitation documented in Henley's digital files was almost too painful to bear. The images provided proof of life, but also proof of unimaginable trauma that no child should ever endure. Detective Williams explained that the digital evidence suggested Tommy had been at the facility for several months after his disappearance, but that his trail went cold after that point. Henley's operation appeared to involve moving children between different locations and eventually placing them in permanent situations that removed them from the possibility of rescue. The detective was honest about the implications. While they had confirmed Tommy's presence at the property, they were no closer to determining his current whereabouts or even whether he was still alive. The news prompted a renewed search effort focused on other properties connected to Henley's network. Sarah Jenkins provided additional information about locations she remembered from her time in Henley's care, leading to search warrants for facilities in 3 additional states. Michael threw himself into supporting these efforts, with the same intensity that had characterized his original investigation, convinced that each new search brought them closer to finding Tommy, or at least learning his ultimate fate. The expanded investigation revealed the true scope of Henley's operation, which had involved dozens of accomplices and hundreds of victims over more than a decade. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began coordinating their efforts, sharing information about missing children cases that might be connected to the network. The investigation had grown far beyond Tommy's individual case, becoming a massive effort to expose and prosecute what appeared to be one of the largest child trafficking operations ever discovered in the United States. As winter approached, Michael found himself grappling with the complex emotions that came with partial answers. The confirmation that Tommy had been alive for months after his disappearance provided some comfort, suggesting that his son had not died immediately or accidentally. However, the knowledge of what Tommy had endured during those months, and the uncertainty about what had happened to him afterward, created new forms of anguish that were in some ways worse than the original mystery of his disappearance. The investigation had also revealed information about Henley himself that shed light on his methods and motivations. Born Robert Henry Kellerman, he had changed his name legally in his 20s following allegations of inappropriate behavior toward children in his extended family. His transformation into Robert Henley had allowed him to begin working in child welfare with a clean background, taking advantage of systems that failed to adequately screen individuals seeking to work with vulnerable children. 8 years and 3 months after Tommy's disappearance, Michael Brennan stood in his backyard on a crisp October morning, watching his neighbor's German shepherd, Max, digging frantically near the old dog kennel that had been built against the fence line between their properties. The behavior was unusual for the normally well-behaved animal, and something about the dog's persistence reminded Michael of his own relentless search for answers about his son's fate. The discovery of Henley's operation had provided some answers, but had also opened new questions that seemed to multiply faster than they could be resolved. Tommy had been confirmed as one of Henley's victims, but his ultimate fate remained unknown. The investigation had expanded to include properties across 6 states, but none of the subsequent searches had yielded additional evidence about Tommy's whereabouts. Michael found himself caught between the relief of knowing that his instincts had been correct and the renewed anguish of understanding what his son had endured. As he watched Max's increasingly frantic digging, something about the location nagged at Michael's consciousness. The kennel had been built by the previous owners of his neighbor's house, an elderly couple named the Washingtons who had moved to a retirement community about 6 months after Tommy's disappearance. Their departure had seemed natural at the time, prompted by Mr. Washington's declining health. But now, Michael found himself wondering about the timing and circumstances of their move. The current neighbors, the Martinez family, had moved in 2 years ago and had mentioned that they found the large dog kennel useful for their German Shepherd, even though it seemed oversized for a single animal. Michael had helped them repair some of the fencing when they first moved in, and he remembered being surprised by how deep and solidly constructed the kennel's foundation appeared to be. At the time, he had assumed that the Washingtons had simply been thorough in their construction, but now he wondered if there might have been another reason for the substantial excavation. Max's digging had exposed what appeared to be concrete or stone beneath the kennel's floor, and the dog's behavior suggested that he was responding to a scent that humans couldn't detect. Michael found himself drawn to the fence line, studying the kennel with new eyes as he considered possibilities that would have seemed far-fetched before his investigation into Henley's network. The timing of the Washingtons' departure, the unusual construction of the kennel, and Max's persistent digging began to form a pattern that sent chills down Michael's spine. He called Detective Williams to share his observations, explaining the timing of the Washingtons' move and the dog's unusual behavior around the kennel. The detective listened patiently, understanding that Michael's 8 years of investigation had trained him to notice details that others might dismiss as coincidental. Williams agreed to look into the Washingtons' background and to consider whether the kennel might warrant closer examination, though he cautioned Michael against drawing premature conclusions based on limited evidence. The investigation into the Washington family revealed information that supported Michael's growing suspicions. Harold Washington had worked as a maintenance supervisor for the school district during the period when Tommy disappeared, giving him access to information about children's schedules and home situations. His wife, Martha, had volunteered with several local children's organizations and had been known for her friendly interactions with neighborhood children. On the surface, they appeared to be model citizens, but their sudden departure from Cedar Falls now seemed potentially significant. More troubling was the discovery that Harold Washington had a brother, Robert Henley, whose birth name had been Robert Washington before his legal name change. The family connection that Michael had been seeking for 8 years had been literally next door to his house the entire time, hidden behind the mundane facade of elderly neighbors who had seemed beyond suspicion. The realization that Tommy's abductor might have been someone who lived within sight of their home, someone who had probably watched their frantic search efforts with secret knowledge, was almost overwhelming. Detective Williams obtained a search warrant for the Martinez property, specifically focusing on the area around the dog kennel where Max had been digging. The Martinez family was shocked to learn about the potential connection to Tommy's case, but cooperated fully with the investigation. They had always wondered about the kennel's unusual construction, and had noticed that Max seemed particularly interested in that area of their yard, but they had attributed his behavior to the scents left by previous animals. The excavation of the kennel area began on a gray Thursday morning, with Michael watching from his own backyard as investigators carefully removed the concrete flooring and began digging into the earth beneath. Linda stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm as they waited to learn what 8 years of searching had been leading toward. The possibility that Tommy had been so close to home all this time, that their frantic searches had taken them hundreds of miles away while their son lay buried just yards from their house, was almost too painful to contemplate. The first discovery came within hours of beginning the excavation. Investigators found fragments of fabric that appeared to be from a child's clothing, buried about 3 feet beneath the kennel floor. The fabric was carefully preserved and sent for analysis, but the pattern and color seemed consistent with the clothes that Tommy had been wearing on the day he disappeared. Michael felt his legs weaken as he realized that they might finally be approaching the end of their long search. As the excavation continued, more evidence emerged from the carefully concealed burial site. A small shoe was recovered, followed by additional clothing fragments and personal items that seemed to belong to a child of Tommy's age. Each discovery brought Michael closer to the terrible confirmation that he had both dreaded and desperately needed for 8 years. The possibility that his son's remains lay beneath the neighbor's dog kennel, that Harold Washington had killed and buried Tommy within sight of their home, was beginning to seem undeniable. The recovery of human remains began late in the afternoon as investigators worked with the careful precision required to preserve evidence while treating the site with appropriate dignity. Michael and Linda were asked to step inside their house while the most difficult part of the excavation took place, but Michael found himself unable to leave the window that overlooked the search site. After 8 years of searching, he needed to witness this final moment, no matter how painful it might be. Detective Williams approached their house as the sun was setting, his expression grave but not without compassion. The remains of a child had been recovered from beneath the kennel, along with personal items that appeared to belong to Tommy. DNA confirmation would take several days, but the preliminary evidence strongly suggested that they had found their son. The search that had consumed 8 years of their lives, that had taken them across multiple states and through countless false hopes, had ended in their own backyard. The arrest warrant for Harold Washington was issued within hours of the discovery, but the elderly man was found dead in his retirement community apartment, apparently having died from natural causes several months earlier. His wife, Martha, was taken into custody for questioning, though her advanced dementia made it unclear whether she could provide useful information about her husband's actions. The justice that Michael had sought for 8 years would never be fully realized, but the truth about Tommy's fate had finally been revealed. As investigators worked through the night to process the crime scene, Michael found himself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions that defied easy description. The grief that had sustained him for 8 years was still present, but it was now accompanied by relief that the uncertainty was finally over. Tommy was gone, and had been gone since shortly after his disappearance, but Michael finally knew what had happened to his son and where his remains lay. The search that had defined his existence for 8 years was complete. The revelation that Tommy's killer had been their next-door neighbor, someone who had participated in the initial search efforts and had offered sympathy and support during the family's darkest hours, added a layer of betrayal to their grief that was almost unbearable. Harold Washington had helped hang missing child posters, had joined search parties, and had consoled Michael and Linda while knowing exactly what had happened to their son. The cruelty of that deception would take years to process and forgive. What moment in this story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this narrative, please subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these stories coming.